Hi guys, it's Melanie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have day 12 of my Once Upon a Book Club Advent box. So stay tuned. So we are in the final day of the Once Upon a Book Club Advent box. We're on day 12. And if you're just tuning in, I definitely recommend you go back and start with day 1, though you can jump in at any point because the stories are not connected. But it came with the 12 days of book club miss with 12 short stories and a gift to go with each day. And so I am reading the stories to you and then opening the gift when we get to that point. There is a place in the story that tells you to stop and open your gift. And when it gets to that point, I'll open the gift and show it to everybody, and then we'll finish the story. And then we'll be finished with this box because it's the last day. I really enjoyed this a lot. So our story for today is The Promise by Hazel Pryor. Everyone assumed that Magnus Flint was fine. This is mainly due to the fact that he told them so. Not that he saw many people now, but his 2 sons, boisterous lads who had inherited Alice's energy and her vivid imagination, occasionally rang up. After they'd finished regaling Magnus with news of everything they'd been doing, they usually remembered to say, "And how are you, Dad?" "Fine," Magnus would reply, "I'm fine." But Magnus wasn't fine. These days, he always felt cold. Sometimes it was a sharp kind of cold that stabbed the inside of his head like splinters. Sometimes it was a damp, slimy cold that coiled about his lungs. And sometimes it was a hard, solid cold that sat heavy on his heart like a stone. Today, Magnus Flint woke up with freezing toes. He waggled them about to see if he could warm them, but it was no use at all. He sighed and pulled himself out of bed, shuffling his feet into his slippers and wrapping himself in his woolen dressing gown. It was still early. He drew back the curtains and looked out. The December sky loomed, gray and empty of birds. The moorland was draped in a thin white veil, pierced through by a few jagged rocks and tufts of heather. Fragments of snow jiggled about in the air and threw themselves against the window pane. Magnus grunted at the scene. Whenever Magnus frowned, his eyebrows, which were extremely bushy, moved closer together, and the wrinkles deepened in his craggy face. "Not much point in it all, really," he muttered, glancing at the photo of Alice that he passed on his way to the kitchen. The Crofters' cottage, where they lived for 3 decades, had always been draughty. But since she'd gone last year, the temperature seemed to have plummeted. Magnus shivered and put the kettle on. He drank his tea and ate his porridge, staring into space. Sooner or later, he'd have to clear away Alice's things. She had started the process after she'd been diagnosed to save him the bother. "I'll mark the boxes so you know what's what," she told him. "Oh, Alice," was all he could manage in reply. The edges of each day were the hardest. Bleak mornings like this morning, then the dark, interminable evenings, robbed of her bright presence and conversation. The boys used to come home more often, but now John was living in Australia with his new partner, and Charlie was fully immersed in his own life. The cottage was so remote it possessed neither broadband nor internet signal. John and Charlie had clubbed together to buy Magnus a little television set, but the only programs he could find were grisly murder mysteries or celebrity chat shows, which he detested. Whatever was wrong with gentle historical dramas? His reverie was interrupted by the phone ringing. He picked it up. This time it was Charlie. "Hey, Dad, guess where I am?" Before Magnus had a chance to reply, he was given the answer. "In York. Got some time off work, and I thought I'd come up to see you. It's been so long." That was certainly true. "When?" Magnus asked, keeping his voice even. "Tomorrow, if that's okay. I'll be bringing Laura and the kids." "You'll what?" "Laura. She wants to meet you. And so do Peppy and Zeb. They're very quiet and well behaved. You'll like them." Magnus sucked in his breath, and his eyebrows pulled so close together they almost met in the middle. Charlie got through girlfriends pretty fast, and he had no doubt that Laura would be history within a month. especially as she had children in tow who weren't Charlie's. Peppy and Zeb. They sounded to Magnus's ears more like aliens than children. Anyway, it was a big ask to put up 4 people in the cottage at such short notice, 3 of whom Magnus had never met before. Charlie had got his optimism and spontaneity entirely from Alice. Magnus wasn't spontaneous by nature. He liked to think long and hard about anything before making a decision. However, it seemed that this decision had already been made for him. "Hang on a mo, Dad. Laura wants to speak to you." There was a short pause, then a fresh, enthusiastic voice said, "Hi, Mr. Flint. I hope you don't mind the imposition. We're staying with my parents right now, and Charlie's been telling us all about you and your wonderful home in Scotland, and we just thought it would be so lovely to come and see you while we're up in the north. Peppy and Zeb are thrilled at the idea too, aren't you guys?" In the background, Magnus could hear a childish chorus of cheers. "Please, don't think you have to lift a finger to prepare for us," Laura went on. "We'll bring all the food, and you don't need to make up beds. We love our sleeping bags." That's thoughtful of you. "But there's not too much to do up here," Magnus warned. "No shops nearby, no cafes or clubs." "No worries," she said cheerfully. "We'll have some wild scrambles up on the moors. It'll be a great adventure for us." "As you wish," he said. Alice would have welcomed them with wide arms and whoops of delight. He should at least try. Magnus spent the next 24 hours worrying. He worried that Laura might be a conniving sort of female who turned on the charm to get whatever she wanted, all the time taking advantage of Charlie's good nature. He did tend to fall for women like that. He worried that Charlie would end up getting hurt. He worried that the relationship would go pear-shaped while they were here, under his roof, and there'd be rows and upset. Most of all, he worried about the 2 children. Even if they really were quiet and well-behaved, it was bound to be awkward. He wouldn't know what to say to them. Besides, wouldn't they hate it here with the lack of facilities and the terrible, terrible cold? However, when Charlie, Laura, and the children arrived, they were far too busy and curious to notice the cold at all. As soon as Charlie had given him a hug, Laura, a rosy-cheeked woman with bouncing blonde curls, strode up to Magnus and declared, "Oh, Mr. Flint, this is so good of you." She swept her arm around at the view. "Look at the mountains. Peppy, Zeb, do you see that pathway winding across the moor? We could go up there later and explore it. Isn't it all magical in the snow?" The children, who with their golden curls looked like miniature versions of their mother, were leaping around, squawking and flapping their arms like excited chickens. Magnus found it all rather alarming. Several trips back and forth from the car seemed to be necessary to bring in all the luggage. How long exactly were they going to stay? He'd completely forgotten to ask, and it seemed rude to do it now. "I'll show everyone around the cottage straight away, if that's all right, Dad," said Charlie, assuming it was. He herded his trio of fans from room to room, pointing out the spiral staircase, the stone alcoves, the twisted driftwood and seashells that Alice had collected. Magnus plodded along in their wake. His visitors were swarming around Alice's attic room before he could stop them. He'd only been up there twice in the last 6 months. She'd used the room as a study and loved it for the view. From the one window you could look over the swell of moor to the distant, glimmering loch, and the purple mountains beyond. When she wasn't dreamily gazing out, Alice spent hours at her desk reading and writing. She was a clever one, her walls lined with books. Now the shelves were bare, and a load of cardboard boxes laid on the floor, with small, neat pictures, felt tipped on their lids. "Are those books in there?" asked Laura. "Yes, my late wife's. I'll be taking them to charity shop if I can find one." "Oh, that seems a shame." "Dad doesn't like reading," Charlie said with a wink. "How can anyone not like reading?" cried Peppy, the little girl staring openly at Magnus. "Sorry, Dad," Charlie chuckled. "You're in a minority here. Laura's a librarian and has brought the children up to love books." Magnus set his lips in a thin line. Once the tour was over and they'd had tea with a semi-squashed chocolate cake that Laura had peeled from its wrapping, Charlie suggested they all go for a bracing walk. It was still snowing, so they muffled up in thick coats and scarves. Not that it made much difference to Magnus. He felt as if he had grown a layer of ice just under his skin. When they stepped outside, the air sliced into his lungs. He tried to ignore his own discomfort and focused on the children. Peppy and Zeb were thrilled at everything. They stuck out their tongues to taste the snow and slide along the icy patches of the path, making it more slippery and difficult for Magnus. They scooted far ahead, then circled back to ask him questions, snowflakes freckling their faces. At least he didn't have to worry about what to say because they did nearly all the talking. Charlie and Laura, meantime, walked deliberately slowly and dropped behind. When Magnus glanced back, he noticed crossly that they were canoodling. So I'm providing a free babysitting service now, he told himself. Still, it all made a change after so long, with only his sad thoughts for company. As they were approaching the crest of the hill, Peppy shouted out, "What's that, Magnus?" He looked over to where she was pointing. At the foot of a group of stunted rowans, in amongst some twisted bramble, was smudge of red against the white. At first he couldn't make out what it was, but then, as they approached, he felt his heart sicken that the children would witness such a sight. The animal was trapped in a snare, a smear of blood darkening its pale fur. It was lying quite still, but when they stooped down, they saw by the rise and fall of its side that it was still breathing. Magnus realized it had been thrashing about in the snare until it had exhausted itself. "Stand back, don't touch it," he warned. Peppy stifled a sob. "Oh, it's so horrible. Poor little thing." "Can we save it?" asked Zeb, whose bottom lip was trembling. "We can try," Magnus said sorrowfully, "but it probably won't survive." The creature looked like something from a fairy tale. Its fur was pure white and soft as brushed cotton. Its ears were pointed and almost translucent, black-tipped as if the edges had been briefly dipped in ink. Its limbs were delicately curved and slender. The underside of its paws showed pink pads. Behind its hind leg was horribly mangled. In the gloved hands, Magnus managed to prise open the hoop of wire and lifted the small body out. He was worried he might get bitten, but the animal just lay there, cradled between his big hands, moist and limp. Its eyes rolled back in terror. The children came closer. He let them stroke it. Charlie and Laura were catching up with them now. "Mom," called Zeb, "we found a rabbit, a white rabbit, like in Alice." Magnus felt his insides jolt at the word Alice, an immediate, involuntary reaction that came with a flood of feeling, grief, love, and loss. "What do you mean, like in Alice?" he demanded. "Alice in Wonderland. We've been reading it," explained Peppy. "It's got a white rabbit in it." Magnus realized now that it wasn't his Alice they were talking about. Of course it was a fictional Alice. He'd never read the story, but remembered his wife saying how she loved it when she was a child. He was so caught up in the moment that he didn't correct Zeb. He knew that the animal they'd found wasn't a rabbit, even though it might look like one. Charlie and Laura joined the group, their faces full of concern. Everyone agreed they should take the creature back to the cottage and see what they could do for it. "Can I carry it?" asked Peppy. "No," Magnus answered, knowing that she was so excitable she would probably drop it, which would finish it off altogether. "Is it a he or a she?" asked Zeb. Magnus shrugged his shoulders. "We don't know." "A she. Definitely a she," insisted Peppy. "It's much too beautiful to be a he." They walked much faster on the way back, now that they had a mission. As soon as they arrived at the cottage, Charlie lit the fire while Laura dabbed the animal's leg with antiseptic wipes and wound it round with bandages from her first aid kit. Magnus was impressed at her practical approach. "Have you got an old jumper or blanket we can wrap her in?" Laura asked. "We'll need to keep her warm." Magnus frowned. He needed all the jumpers and blankets in his possession. I know," cried Peppy. "We can use the story blanket. She needs it more than we do. It's still in our luggage." She dashed out of the room and reappeared a moment later with a tatty red blanket. "It's what we spread out and sit on every night when we read stories," she explained to Magnus. "So it's got magic in it." "What shall we call our rabbit?" asked Zeb, as they wrapped the long-suffering creature in the blanket and laid her beside the hearth. "It's not a rabbit," said Magnus. They all looked at him in surprise. He cleared his throat. "It's a mountain hare." He'd seen them a few times before on his rambles, watched them bounding across the heather in zigzags. They had always seemed to him to be mystical, enigmatic creatures. "Wild rabbits are brown, and so are hares normally," he explained, "but mountain hares turn white in winter to match the snow." "Oh, that's very clever," said Peppy. "Very remarkable," her brother said, as if correcting her. Magnus was amused at Zeb's use of the word remarkable. He must have picked it up from somewhere. What would you like to call her, Zeb? Laura asked. Rabbit, the little boy replied. That's ridiculous, snorted Charlie. You can't call a hare Rabbit. Nothing wrong with being ridiculous, Magnus found himself saying. Ridiculous can be fun. And he could almost see in his mind's eye Alice smiling and nodding her head in approval. I found her, so it's me who should name her, Peppy said indignantly. And I am going to call her Harebell. That's a great name, Peppy, said Laura. She explained to Zeb, Harebell is a flower that grows here in Scotland, a gorgeous, delicate flower that's the loveliest shade of blue. If we come up here again in the summer, we might see some. There was a meaningful silence here, full of unspoken questions. None of the adults looked at each other. I wonder what's the Latin name for the flower, Laura said, filling the pause before it became too unbearable. Could we look it up, Magnus? Doubtless there'd be a reference to harebells in several of Alice's wildflower books, but he wasn't too keen on the idea of searching through an index. He felt panicky at the mere thought of it, and ashamed. Luckily, Laura didn't push it. How about calling her Harebell with an extra L and E? She suggested. Belle is the French for beautiful, so that would fit. Peppy clapped her hands. Let's just call her Belle then. Belle lay still on the old red story blanket, her eyes closed now. Her life flickered like a thin flame that might be snuffed out at any moment. Laura and Charlie decided to cook a meal for everyone. They bustled around, taking up the whole kitchen. The smell of pastry and onions started wafting pleasantly through the cottage, but Magnus didn't quite know what to do with himself. Eventually, he settled in the sitting room with the children to make sure they weren't disturbing Belle too much. They wouldn't leave her alone. They unpacked some toys, and Zeb announced that he would build a castle for Belle out of Lego. He soon got distracted, though, and started playing with toy cars instead, zooming them across the hearth rug and making broom broom noises. Every so often, he drove them across to where Belle was lying. Peppy took out some colored pencils and sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing the sick hair, her face furrowed in concentration. She showed Magnus the picture when she'd finished. It doesn't look much like a hare, he thought. I could do better than that. Have you got a box, Magnus? Peppy asked. I think Belle needs to sleep in a nice snug box for the night. The only boxes he had were Alice's, full of books. He shook his head vehemently. No. At last Charlie called them into the kitchen. Simple fare, but the children will eat it, Laura said, serving up generous helpings of cheese and onion pie with broccoli and potatoes. Magnus found himself sitting between Peppy and Zeb, who immediately started shoveling food into their mouths. He ate at a slower rate and asked Laura polite questions about her background and her parents in New York. He registered that Peppy was glaring at him. Magnus, I know who you're like, she announced suddenly. You're like Ebenezer Scrooge. Who's he? Magnus asked. Don't you know anything? She huffed. Well, at least I know the difference between a rabbit and a hare, he retorted. But everyone knows who Ebenezer Scrooge is. Who is he, and why am I like him? Magnus asked, slightly dreading the answer. He's in Dickens. He's mean, and he won't give anyone anything. Like you won't give Belle a box. Peppy, Laurie scolded. What did I tell you about your big mouth? Peppy turned to Magnus again. Mummy says I have a big mouth, but I haven't. I know I haven't because I measured it with my ruler, and it's only 3 centimeters across. It's wider when I'm smiling, though, she added. When you smile, your mouth goes wider, see? She demonstrated, revealing to Magnus various bits of broccoli that were stuck between her teeth. Shh, now, Peppy, said Laura. Eat your food before it gets cold. But it was only a moment before Peppy piped up again. Can I measure your mouth, Magnus, please? Magnus did not want to be compared with Ebenezer Scrooge any more, so he agreed. There was no escape. As soon as they'd finished the meal, Peppy came towards him, brandishing her ruler. 6.5, she declared. Now smile. He obeyed. It had been ages since he produced a smile, and for a moment it gave him a little tingle of warmth. That's amazing! 9, said Peppy, gazing at the ruler. He couldn't help joining in with her giggles. Come upstairs with me and help me choose a box for Belle, he said. Peppy followed him upstairs to the attic room. That one, she said. They took out Alice's books together and left them in a huge untidy heap on the floor. Look, this book's all about nature, Peppy told him, holding one of them up for him to see. We could find out what Belle likes to eat. Magnus knew the book from the times Alice had brought it down to the fireside and read excerpts out to him. He remembered a picture of a hare on one of the pages. He leafed through until he found it. In the photo, a milk-white hare sat alert on a grassy knoll, its ears pointing upwards towards a lilac sky. Look, Peppy, it could be Belle, couldn't it? She nodded. What does it say? Sorry, he said, patting his pockets. I have no idea where I put my glasses. Why don't you read it out to me? Peppy pronounced the words slowly as she followed each sentence with her finger. Unlike the brown hare, which was introduced in Roman times, the mountain hare is native to the Scottish Highlands. It is most common on uplands and heath. It has a gray-brown coat in summer with a bluish tinge, and it turns white in winter. Instead of burrows, mountain hares shelter in shallow scrapes in the ground. They graze on vegetation and the bark of bushes and saplings. If she's any better tomorrow, we'll go and find her some bark and vegetation first thing, said Magnus. I've changed my mind about you, Peppy told him, beaming. You're not like Ebenezer Scrooge at all. Belle showed no signs of recovery that evening. In spite of her new box and story blanket bedding, the children clamored to take her up to their bedroom with them. No, she needs to stay warm by the fire, Magnus told them. She can't get well otherwise. They went up to bed reluctantly, yawning and rubbing their eyes. Magnus was exhausted himself and relieved when at last, in the privacy of his own bedroom, he could collapse. He decided he liked Laura, Peppy, and Zeb, though. Charlie could do a lot worse. At around 2 in the morning, Magnus threw on his dressing gown and went downstairs to heat up a mug full of milk. He was surprised to see a light on in the sitting room. He crept up to the door and peeped around it. There, by the embers of the fire, sat Zeb in spotty pajamas, his head bent over a book. He was reading out loud to Belle. He paused, catching sight of Magnus. I need to keep her warm by reading her stories, he said earnestly. Magnus lifted his eyebrows. Stories to keep her warm? It was a whimsical idea, one that Alice would have liked. Maybe that's what I need too, Magnus thought, pulling his dressing gown closer around him. Stories to keep me warm. He sat down in the big armchair and listened as Zeb finished reading. The boy stumbled over some of the words, but read all the way through to the end. I'd show her the pictures too, he told Magnus, but she's got her eyes closed. Magnus bent down to look, fearing the hare was dead. Belle was still breathing, but the breaths were faint and shallow. He took Zeb's small hand in his. I know you want to save her, of course you do, but no matter how much you want to, it may not be possible. He thought of Alice and felt a prickling at the back of his eyes. As Zeb traced back upstairs, Magnus listlessly picked up one of the children's books that was lying on the floor. He opened the first page and stared at the sentences. To him, they were just a string of squiggles, a strange code that he couldn't unlock. His mind traveled back over the years. He'd been the quietest boy in his school, sitting at the back of class, and the teachers had thought he was just a bit slow. None of them realized he had never learned to read. He had found ways of bluffing. He could write his own name and recognize words that he needed for daily life, like go and stop and sweets and later beer. But that was about it. Alice had been the only one who knew. She had offered to teach him, but he decided it would try her patience too much. It was too late. He drained his milk and stomped back to bed, feeling as cold as ever. Over the next couple of days, Belle stayed in her box, nestled in the story blanket. She was so weak she could scarcely lift her head, but she hung on to life. Peppy and Zeb nursed her. They quenched her thirst by carefully opening her jaw and squeezing water into her mouth from a wet rag. They stalked out onto the snowy moor to gather her fresh grasses and damp crumpled bark from the trees, and often they would read to her. On the day they were to leave, Zeb turned an imploring face up to Magnus. When we've gone, you must read her stories every day. Well, I promise, he demanded. Magnus wavered. He didn't like lying, but neither did he like disappointing people. Oh, all right, I promise. Peppy was determined to be businesslike. I'll leave you our books because the ones you have might be too grown up for her, she said, and she can keep the story blanket. If she survives, can we come back and see her in a couple of months' time? Laura asked. Yes, of course you can, Magnus replied. Although she's a wild animal and will want to run. If she gets better, I shall set her free in the hills. Then maybe we could have a grand ceremony and all free her together, said Charlie. Magnus was delighted at that together. He hoped that they'd have that excuse to visit again soon. When they'd gone, the house fell silent again. It's just you and me now, Belle, so I'd be grateful if you didn't die on me, Magnus muttered, looking down at the hare. She was still unable to stand, but she stirred a little. She had grown used to human contact and seemed to trust him. Magnus was glad for her company. Her pointed, whiskery face, shining brown eyes, and fur that was so soft to touch. In the evening, he lit the fire. He had promised the children he'd read to Belle every day, so he shuffled through their books. One was an alphabet book. Some of the letters looked familiar. He fetched a pen and paper and carefully copied out the ones he didn't know. He repeated the action again and again, covering his paper with loops and lines. He worked his way through the alphabet. Then he scrutinized the first words in the book, speaking the sounds out loud. Belle pricked up her ears. Over the following weeks, Magnus looked after her tenderly and grew more and more fond of her. Even on the rawest, iciest days, he went out to forage on her behalf. He supplemented her diet with his own breakfast porridge oats. When he approached her box, she looked up at him with expectant eyes and twitched her velvety nose. She was eating more every day, and one morning he found she had nibbled a hole in the red story blanket. Magnus studied hard. It was good to have a project to focus his mind. Sometimes, when he couldn't work out a word, he threw the book to the floor with a growl of frustration. Then he remembered Peppy and Zeb's eager faces. He picked the book up again, took a deep breath, and started over. One evening, he managed to read Belle one of the children's stories from beginning to end, with the help of the pictures and some guesswork. I did it, Belle, I did it. He was so delighted he lifted Belle from her box, placing her on his lap, and read it all over again. Charlie rang often and put Laura and the children on the line to chat to Magnus. They were all keen to know how Belle was faring. I'm letting her limp around the room, he told them. Her leg is getting stronger. She's inquisitive about everything, and she likes exploring, but she misses you. We'll come and visit at half-term, said Peppy. Keep reading her stories until then. I will. Magnus drew pictures of Belle for Peppy and Zeb. He managed to write titles on the pictures in big, wavering capital letters. Belle asleep. Belle on the blanket. Belle with a shell. Belle with a ball. Belle with a bell. He read the words out to himself, and they pleased him. He owned some printed labels with Charlie's address on them, and so he sent his drawings to the children via Charlie. Sometimes he received letters and drawings back. Magnus let Belle lollop around the cottage. She left frequent messages, as he liked to call them, which he didn't always notice until after he'd stepped on them. However, he kept a bucket and cloth handy and didn't really mind. She gnawed through the electric lead to his television, which he didn't much mind either. No matter what she'd been up to, she always looked sweet and angelic. He made a run in the garage and put her out on warmer days. Then every night he returned her to her box and read to her by the fire. As the old red blanket became lacy with chewed holes, Magnus and Belle gorged on stories. Magnus realized that sometimes he wasn't reading for the sake of the children, or even for Belle. He was reading for himself. He felt an excitement now whenever he picked up a story he hadn't read before. Where would it lead him? What wonderful characters would he meet? What would happen to them? January slowly melted into February. The day approached when Charlie was to bring Laura and the children back for a second visit. Belle's injured leg had become strong and muscular, and her pale fur had grown a few streaks of brown. It was time to release her back into the wild, but Magnus had promised to wait until they were all gathered to say goodbye to her. He kept the fire roaring all day to make the cottage cozy, and took a trip to the shops to stock up with food the children liked. Jaffa cakes for Peppy, and tomato ketchup with everything he remembered for Zeb. He went out to the woods and picked a handful of snowdrops for each bedside. He dreamed of picking harebells for his visitors in the summer. The night before they were due, Charlie rang. "It'll just be me, Dad." "What?" "It's just me coming tomorrow." His voice was terse. "I've split up with Laura. You won't be seeing her or the kids again." And he rang off. Magnus didn't move for a long time. His heart felt like an old log that had been floating along a river, dragged down at last by the currents. He wandered into the sitting room, lifted Belle from her box, and took her in his arms. She nuzzled his cheek. He buried his face in her fur. When Charlie arrived the next day, there were dark rims around his eyes. Father and son embraced. "What happened?" Magnus asked, pouring tea from the pot and thinking how different this was from his last visit. Charlie heaved a sigh. "I'd promised to collect Peppy and Zeb from after-school club, but I was busy with bills and I forgot. Laura was furious. She called me irresponsible." Magnus didn't like to say it, but he couldn't help thinking the same. "We shouted at each other, and that was it." "I'm sorry," Magnus said, and meant it. Charlie looked at his feet. "Oh, by the way, there's a present for you from Laura and the kids." Magnus blinked. "She got it when we were together, and you might as well have it anyway, because I won't be seeing her to return it," Charlie said grumpily. He passed Magnus a large parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. It felt heavy and bulky. Magnus untied the string, but the gift was wrapped in another layer of paper inside, this time decorated with leaping white rabbits and a blue ribbon. A note fell out. Magnus stared at it. There was an address at the top of the message, began, "Dear Magnus." He didn't have the heart to open the gift. Charlie and he made a few desultory attempts at conversation over their fish dinner and went to bed early. Recently, Magnus hadn't been noticing the cold so much, but that night it attacked him like a cruel monster with claws and teeth. He lay shivering, tussling with bedclothes, unable to sleep. Finally, he gave up, switched on his bedside lamp, and reached for a pen and paper. He sat up for hours, practicing letters, writing them out over and over until he was sure he got his message right. Then, as the sun was rising and he could still hear snores coming from Charlie's room, he went on a long walk to the nearest post box. The next few days were dull, blank, and freezing cold. The two men tried to make conversation and laugh, but both found it difficult. Magnus was too embarrassed to read to Belle any stories with his son there. "Why don't you give Laura a ring?" he asked. "What? A ring? Oh, you mean phone her?" "No, couldn't," was all Charlie said, his face oddly crumpled. "When are you going to release the hair then?" he added, evidently keen to change the subject. "I thought you were going to do it this week." "I know I should. I will soon," Magnus replied, but somehow he didn't feel able to part with Belle. Chilly gusts of wind rustled around the cottage. A powdery dusting of white had settled on the hilltops, and snow drifted in the hollows of the land. Charlie went for lots of long, solitary walks. That was good for him, Magnus thought. He needed time to reflect. On the third day, Charlie returned to the cottage, red-nosed and windswept. He stopped abruptly as he opened the front door. There, before his eyes, was not the sad, grizzled man he'd been expecting, but a vibrant, golden-haired young family. Zeb was standing proudly with Belle in his arms. Peppy was dancing about and grinning from ear to ear, and there, just behind them, was the person Charlie had been thinking about non-stop ever since he split up with her, Laura. She took a step towards him. Peppy and Zeb wanted to see Belle one last time, she explained, and she cast her eyes down and then raised them again to look at him. "And I wanted to see you." She smiled a beguiling smile, and Magnus wrote and said we could come. Charlie frowned and crossed his arms. "Dad wrote to you? But Dad never writes to anyone." "I do now," Magnus muttered, appearing from the sitting room. "Now, Peppy and Zeb, why don't you bring Belle outside? I want to show you the run I made for her." He ushered the children outside and closed the door, leaving an astonished Charlie and a hopeful Laura to sort things out between themselves. It was not all resolved at once. It started with recriminations, continued with apologies, went on to reminiscences, and then, several hours later, progressed to plans. There would be many further arrangements to come in the fullness of time. A ring must be bought, and then there was a ceremony to organize. But first, there was another ceremony, perhaps one that was almost as important as far as the children were concerned. One blustery morning, beneath a ragged sky, they all went out together. The sun danced in and out of the clouds, and every sprig of heather glistened with melted frost. Peppy carried Belle, who bucked and struggled to get loose, her hind legs now powerful, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the fresh air. "I think she can sense her freedom coming," said Magnus, as they approached the brow of the hill. They had already had a bonfire and burned the old red story blanket, which had served its purpose. "I hope she doesn't miss her bedtime stories too much," whispered Zeb. They passed Belle solemnly round, and each of them held her for a minute. "She's a well-cuddled hare," said Charlie, putting an arm around Laura and pulling her close. He passed Belle on to Magnus. Magnus stood stroking the hare for one last time, holding back a tide of emotion. He'd given her another chance at life, and strangely, unexpectedly, she had given him one too. At last he set her down on the ground. The breeze ruffled her fur. She crouched low, unsure of herself. Then her eyes grew wide, her nose twitched, her ears sprang up. Suddenly she took a bound, then another. Tears were streaming down the children's faces. They waved and waved as they watched her leaping away from them, her white tail bobbing through the mounds of heather, until she finally melted into the distance. "She's gone back to Wonderland, hasn't she?" said Zeb. To him she would always be the White Rabbit. Magnus fixed his eyes on the horizon. "Yes, she has. She's off on her wild adventures now." "Do you think we'll ever see her again?" asked Peppy. Magnus closed his eyes and imagined them all returning when the trees were green and the slopes were ablaze with color. Might they catch a glimpse of Belle then, perhaps with her own family of tiny leverets lopping about in the sunshine? I hope so. Charlie, Laura, Peppy, and Zeb left the cottage soon after, all set for the long drive south. Magnus ate his dinner alone that night. He consoled himself with the knowledge that they'd be back soon enough, and they'd be frequent visitors from now on. He trudged up to Alice's old room. The boxes were still sitting there, with just one mountain of books loose on the floor. He started sorting through them, reading the titles out loud. Then he took the other books out of the boxes, one by one, and arranged them back on the shelves where they used to be. Who knows? One day he might read them all, he mumbled to himself. He understood at last that his wife had found a wonderland, not just in Lewis Carroll's story, but in many, many books, and now Belle had led him to that wonderland too. He paused for a moment and looked out the window into the deep starry night. What was Belle doing right now? As he turned back from the window, his eyes fell on Laura's parcel, still sitting unopened on the desk. He gingerly unwrapped the paper. In amazement, he pulled out what was inside, and now we stop and read our gift. Okay, the last gift. It is this big soft blanket, and I freaking love it. It is a page from a book, and it's actually page 4 from the book of Alice in Wonderland. So I don't know that I could show it all on here, but we have the White Rabbit here on the corner. Yeah, it's quite long. Like, it's quite wide, and it's at least, I'd say it's at least 5 feet long. I think it's longer than that, because I think it's longer than me. I love this. This is awesome. It's thin, which is why it could fit in that. It's like this, but it's very, very soft, and I love it. Okay, let's finish our story. If Peppy had been there with her ruler, she would have been very impressed with his smile. It must have been at least 10 centimeters wide. Magnus glanced at the clock. It was long past his bedtime. He took the gift with him to his room, snuggled in bed, and settled down to read. It was the beginning of a new story. He pulled the blanket up around his shoulders and felt warm right down to his toes. The end. And then there's like a section in the back that tells you about all the authors and stuff, but I love this gift. I'm a big Alice fan. So that was a great note to end on. That was a super cute story. I thought so anyway. Did you like it? Did you not? Comment down below and let me know. And let me know what you thought of this box and this series of me reading the stories. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a big thumbs up. If you'd like to see more videos like this, click that subscribe button down below. And until next time, remember to always be completely you. Bye.